For 38 years, Eleanor kept that map folded inside her father's old Bible. Her husband Douglas saw it 100 times, picked it up once, turned it over, set it back down without a word. Just an old piece of paper, he said, not worth anything. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. When Douglas took the house, the savings, and somehow the loyalty of their own children, he believed he had taken everything. He left Eleanor with 2 suitcases and a rented room and the kind of silence that follows a life that's being systematically dismantled. He forgot about the map. That one small oversight, a folded piece of paper he dismissed decades ago, would cost him more than he could ever calculate. This is the story of what Eleanor found at the end of her father's map, and why the man who thought he'd taken everything had actually left her the only thing that truly mattered. If stories about women who refuse to stay down mean something to you, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We share stories like Eleanor's every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Eleanor Marsh was 67 years old, and she had spent the better part of 4 decades making a house feel like a home. Not the kind that impresses visitors, but the kind that holds a family together through ordinary, unremarkable days. She cooked Sunday dinners until her children left for college. She handled the leaking roof and the broken furnace and the taxes and the dentist appointments, while Douglas handled his career, his clients, and eventually his distance. Her father Harold had died 3 years before any of this began. A quiet man, a retired land surveyor who spent his weekends in the garden and his evenings reading history. When he was sick, really sick, the kind where you measure time in weeks instead of months, he called Eleanor to his bedside and pressed a folded piece of paper into her hands. It was a map, hand-drawn in pencil on yellowed paper, marked with roads and coordinates and a small cross in the lower right corner. In the margin, her father's cramped handwriting. Grandfather's land, still ours. Don't let it go. Eleanor looked at it, then looked at him. Go there when you have nothing left to lose, Harold said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Promise me. She promised. Then she folded the map and tucked it into his Bible, which he packed after the funeral. Douglas saw it that same evening, picking it up off the kitchen counter. What's this? Papa's map. Some land grandfather once owned. Douglas turned it over once, set it back down, reached for his phone. One glance, then forgotten. The marriage had been cooling for years before Eleanor allowed herself to see it clearly. Douglas came home later and later, stopped asking about her day, started taking calls in the other room and ending them when she walked in. She told herself it was stress, that it was the age, that couples go through phases. She had built too much to start questioning the foundation. But 3 years after Harold's death, standing in the dark hallway at 2 a.m. with a glass of water, Eleanor heard Douglas's voice through the study door, which was open just an inch. She wasn't trying to listen. She didn't need to. She stood there for a long moment. Then she set the glass on the hallway table and walked back to the bedroom. She didn't sleep. Douglas filed on a Tuesday. Eleanor found out the way people find out about things they should have been told directly. Through a letter from an attorney she'd never heard of, delivered to her own address with her own name printed on the envelope in cold institutional font. She read it twice, standing at the kitchen counter. Then she put it down and made coffee. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't sure what that meant. The attorney Douglas had hired was young, expensive, and thorough. He'd been building the case for months. Eleanor understood that within the first meeting with her own lawyer, a tired woman named Patricia, who reviewed the papers with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had seen this exact situation too many times. He's claiming the house as his primary financial contribution to the marriage, Patricia said. His income, his mortgage payments. 38 years of that argument. I raised our children in that house, Eleanor said. I know, but that's not how his team is going to frame it. The children were named Michael and Susan, both in their 30s. Both, Eleanor had believed until this moment, fundamentally decent people. Michael called her the second week of proceedings. She could hear the discomfort in his voice before he said a single word. Mom, I think you should consider settling. Dad's lawyer is saying this could get drawn out and expensive. And honestly, the house is a lot for one person. Eleanor sat with the phone pressed to her ear and said nothing for a moment. A lot for one person, she repeated. I just mean, I know what you mean. She didn't hear from Susan for another 2 weeks. When Susan did call, she opened with, Dad told us about the offer. I think Patricia is steering you wrong. Douglas had spoken to both of them before either child had called Eleanor. She understood then that this was not a coincidence. It was a strategy. The court date came on a grey morning in March. Eleanor wore the blue jacket she'd bought for her daughter-in-law's baby shower. She sat beside Patricia and listened to a man she'd never met describe her marriage in financial terms. Contributions, assets, valuations. 38 years reduced to columns. She kept her face still. She had practiced keeping her face still. Douglas sat across the room. He didn't look at her once. Not once in 4 hours. The man she had made a home for, cooked for, worried over, stayed up waiting for. He sat 12 feet away and treated her like a line item. The house went to Douglas. He had paid the mortgage. His name was on the original deed. Eleanor had signed a refinancing agreement 11 years ago without reading it closely, because Douglas had handed her the pen and said, just formality, don't worry. Patricia had found it in the documents and gone quiet in a way that told Eleanor everything. She was given a settlement, a number that sounded reasonable until she calculated what it would cost to rent a one-bedroom apartment for the rest of her life. She went back to the house that afternoon to pack. Douglas was not there. He had been considerate enough to be absent. She moved through the rooms with the 2 largest suitcases she owned. Clothes, her mother's dishes, Harold's Bible with the map still folded inside, a photograph from their first year in the house, Michael as a toddler in the backyard, Eleanor laughing at something off camera, Douglas's hand visible at the edge of the frame. She left the photograph on the kitchen table. She took the Bible. At the front door she stopped and looked back at the hallway, at the marks on the door frame where she'd measured the children every birthday, at the coat hooks she'd installed herself because Douglas had never gotten around to it, at 38 years of ordinary living pressed into the walls, like a smell you can't quite place, but always recognize. Then she picked up her suitcases and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold March air. She did not cry. She had done enough of that at night, alone, when the outcome was still uncertain and hope still cost something. Now that there was nothing left to hope for, the tears had stopped too. She drove to the rented room she'd found 2 weeks earlier. 3rd floor of a house owned by a woman named Carol who asked no questions and charged first and last month up front. Eleanor sat on the narrow bed and put Harold's Bible on the nightstand. The map was inside it. She didn't open the Bible that night. The room was 11 feet wide. Eleanor knew because she measured it on the 3rd day, walking heel to toe along the wall while Carol's television played through the floor below. 11 feet, a window that faced a brick wall, a radiator that knocked twice every hour, like a reminder. She built a routine the way you build anything when you have nothing else to do, out of necessity and the quiet fear of what happens if you stop moving. She woke at 7, made coffee on the small electric kettle she'd bought at a thrift store for $4, walked to the library when the weather allowed, came back, read, slept badly, repeated. The settlement money sat in her account like a clock counting down. Michael called twice in the first month, then once, then a text on her birthday. A single line, no punctuation, the kind you send when you remember at the last minute and feel guilty for forgetting. Susan didn't call at all. Eleanor heard through Michael, almost in passing, that Douglas had someone. Her name was apparently Renee. She was 51, she liked to travel. Eleanor received this information standing at the library's periodical rack, pretending to read the cover of a magazine. She stood there for a while after Michael hung up. Then she put the magazine back and walked home. It was Patricia who told her about the payment. A letter, not a call. Patricia was a letter person. The settlement disbursement had been delayed due to a procedural issue on Douglas's end. 30 to 60 days. Eleanor read the letter, folded it, and placed it on the nightstand beside the Bible. She had $640 left in her checking account. Carol knocked on her door on a Thursday evening. Her expression had the practiced gentleness of someone delivering news they've been rehearsing. The house was going on the market. Her daughter needed the income from a proper rental. Eleanor would have 30 days. "I'm sorry," Carol said, and seemed to mean it. "It's all right," Eleanor said, and did not mean it at all. After Carol left, she sat on the edge of the bed and did the arithmetic again. 30 days, $640. First and last month on anything decent in this city started at $1,800. The settlement wasn't coming for 60 days minimum. No income. No family offering a spare room. She had called Michael once, to mention that things were tight. He had said, "We'll figure something out, Mom," and then not called back. She sat with that for a long time. At some point, she reached over and picked up the Bible. She wasn't looking for comfort. She didn't know what she was looking for. She opened it, and the map slid out and fell onto the blanket. She picked it up and unfolded it slowly. Her father's handwriting in the margin. "Grandfather's land, still ours. Don't let it go." She had looked at this map perhaps a dozen times since Harold died. Each time she'd thought, later, when things settle, when there's time. There had always been a reason to wait. Douglas's opinion of it, an old piece of paper, had lodged itself in her somewhere without her noticing, the way his opinions often had. But Douglas wasn't here. Douglas had taken the house and the children and his clean new life with Renee, who liked to travel. And he had not taken this, because he had never believed it was worth taking. Go there when you have nothing left to lose. Eleanor looked around the 11-foot room, the $4 kettle, the narrow bed, the window that faced the wall. She thought about her father, not the dying version pressed into the hospital pillow, but the one she remembered best, standing in his garage on a Saturday morning with a survey map spread across the workbench, tracing roads with one finger, explaining property lines to a 12-year-old who half listened and mostly watched the dust float in the light. Harold had known land the way other men knew music or engines. He had trusted this map enough to make her promise. She had nothing left to lose. She folded the map carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she opened her laptop and looked up the coordinates her father had written in the lower corner of the page, 40-year-old pencil on yellowed paper. The coordinates were real. They landed on a rural county in the eastern part of the state, 2 hours and 40 minutes away. She closed the laptop. She packed one bag. In the morning, she would go. She left before sunrise. The car was a 2009 Honda with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on the right side only. She drove with her coat pulled around her shoulders and the map on the passenger seat, folded open to show the coordinates and the small cross her father had drawn in pencil 40 years ago. The highway gave way to county roads. County roads gave way to 2-lane blacktop that cut through flat farmland, then into hills covered in bare early spring trees. The GPS lost confidence somewhere past the last gas station, offering routes with increasing uncertainty before going quiet altogether. Eleanor drove by the map. Her father had been a land surveyor for 31 years. The roads he'd marked were old but accurate. She found the turnoff exactly where the map said it would be. An unpaved track disappearing between 2 leaning fence posts, no signage, no mailbox. She almost missed it. She parked where the track ended, 50 yards in, at a rusted gate that had not been opened in years. Beyond it, through the trees, she could see the outline of a structure. She climbed the gate. The land was overgrown but not wild. Old fence lines still held their shape. What had once been a cleared field was returning slowly to brush, but the bones of it were still visible. The logic of a farm laid out by someone who knew what they were doing. Her grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1923. Harold had told her that much. Had told her almost nothing else. The structure was a farmhouse, 1-story, timber frame. The roof partially collapsed on the east side, but holding on the west. The front door was gone. The windows were empty frames. Inside, Eleanor moved carefully, testing floorboards before putting her weight down, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light that came through the broken roof. The main room, a kitchen area, a back bedroom with a rusted bed frame still against the wall. and a door. Low, set into the back wall of the kitchen, partially hidden behind what remained of a wooden cabinet that had fallen sideways. Eleanor moved the cabinet with both hands, one section at a time. The door behind it was small. She would have to duck to enter, made of thick planked wood with an iron handle, the kind of door built to last. She pulled. It held. She pulled harder and felt it give. Not locked, but swollen with decades of moisture. And then it opened with a sound like something exhaling. Stone steps led down into darkness. She used her phone as a light. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet square, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Dry, remarkably dry. The stone had done its work for 90 years. In the corner, stacked against the far wall and covered with what had once been canvas and was now mostly grey dust, were 4 wooden crates. Eleanor crossed the cellar in 4 steps and crouched in front of the nearest crate. The wood was old but solid. Cedar. A metal clasp, corroded but not fused. She worked it open with the edge of her car key. Inside, wrapped in cloth that crumbled slightly at her touch, were coins. Gold coins. Dozens of them, lying in careful rows the way someone had placed them deliberately, not thrown in, but arranged. Liberty had double eagles. Her phone light caught the edges and threw small bright arcs across the stone walls. She sat back on her heels. Her grandfather had not trusted banks. Harold had told her that once, years ago, almost as an aside. Papa buried everything he had in 1932, said the banks were thieves. Never told us exactly where. A fragment of a story she had filed away and half forgotten. He had told Harold. Somehow, eventually, Harold had known. And Harold had drawn a map and waited for the right time to pass it on. And then time had run out, and he had pressed it into her hands in a hospital room and asked her to promise. She opened the second crate. More coins. And beneath them, wrapped separately in oilcloth that had held better than the canvas above, documents. Property deeds. Her grandfather's name. Her father's name. A notarized transfer dated 1987. Harold had quietly secured the title before illness took him. The land was hers by direct inheritance. She opened the third crate and the fourth. By the time she sat back against the cold stone wall, her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the particular physical shock of something shifting. The ground rearranging itself beneath a life that had been told for months it had nowhere left to stand. She stayed in the cellar for a long time. Her phone light caught the coins again and again as she turned them slowly in her hands. Liberty Head, St. Gaudens, dates from the 1890s through the 1920s. Her grandfather's savings pulled from banks and buried in wood and stone and kept safe through 90 years of weather and silence, and one family's quiet faithfulness to a piece of land everyone else had forgotten. Douglas had forgotten. She climbed the stone steps and stood in the ruined kitchen and looked at the door she'd opened. Then she called the only attorney she still trusted, Patricia, who answered on the third ring. "I need you to research a property title," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "And I need to know who you call about a collection of gold coins that may be worth more than either of us can currently imagine." A pause on the line. "Eleanor, where are you?" "My grandfather's land," she said. "Mine, actually. I just didn't know it until now." Patricia arrived 2 days later with a numismatist from the State University and a title attorney named Gordon, who specialized in rural property inheritance. Eleanor met them at the gate with the rusted clasp and walked them down the stone steps herself. The numismatist, a small, precise man named Dr. Aldrich, spent 40 minutes in the cellar before he came back up. He stood in the ruined kitchen and removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, which Eleanor would later understand was something he did when he needed a moment to compose himself. "These are genuine," he said, "pre-1933 gold coinage, well preserved due to the cedar and the dry conditions. The collection runs to approximately 260 individual coins. Conservative estimate for auction would be in the range of $900,000. That's conservative." Eleanor was standing by the empty window frame. Outside, the early spring trees were just beginning to show green at the tips of the branches. "And the land?" she asked. Gordon answered that one. The title was clean. Harold's 1987 transfer was properly notarized and recorded at the county level, quietly filed, never challenged, never noticed by anyone who might have had reason to complicate it. 230 acres, including a section of river frontage that a conservation group had been trying to acquire for 3 years. They've made offers before to the county on adjacent parcels, Gordon said. Land with river access in this area is selling for between $4,000 and $6,000 per acre. Eleanor did the arithmetic without moving her expression. She thanked them both and walked them back to their cars. Then she stood alone at the gate for a while, in the cold air, looking at the farmhouse through the bare trees. Her grandfather had built that house with his hands. Her father had protected the land quietly for decades, waiting, keeping the secret close, drawing a map for the daughter he trusted most. 3 generations of careful, patient people who believe that what you build and protect honestly will eventually find its way to someone who deserves it. Douglas had been in her life for 38 years. He had never once been patient. Michael called on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Patricia had filed the formal paperwork establishing Eleanor's ownership and initiated the appraisal process. Word traveled in ways Eleanor no longer tried to understand. Douglas had his sources. Douglas had always had sources. Mom. Michael's voice carried the specific weight of a person trying to sound casual about something they were not casual about. I heard you found something on some land. I did. That's incredible. We had no idea about any of that, about Grandpa's property. No, Eleanor said, you didn't. A pause. I feel terrible about how things went, with the house. I should have... Michael. She said his name gently, but without softness. I know what you're going to say, and I believe you mean it. But you made a choice when it mattered, and this is a different moment, and those two things don't cancel each other out. He was quiet for a long time. Is there anything I can do? Be honest with yourself about what happened, she said. That's a thing you can do. Susan called the following week. The conversation was shorter and covered the same ground. Eleanor was kind. She was also clear. She had learned in the months since March the difference between those two things. That kindness did not require her to pretend, and clarity did not require cruelty. Douglas she heard about only through Patricia, who reported that his attorney had made one inquiry regarding the property and its inheritance status. Gordon had responded with the complete documentation. There was no follow-up. Douglas was a man who knew when a position was indefensible. It was, Eleanor reflected, perhaps the most useful thing she had learned from 38 years with him. By autumn, she had sold the mineral and timber rights on a portion of the land to the conservation group, retaining the farmhouse parcel and the river frontage. The farmhouse she was restoring slowly, with a local contractor named Bill who had grown up 2 counties over and treated old timber frame construction with the seriousness it deserved. She was living in a rented cottage on the property's edge while the work continued. It was small, but it was hers. Hers in the way the rented room had never been. Hers in the way the house she'd shared with Douglas had ultimately not been. The difference was not square footage. The difference was that no one could hand her a letter and take this away. On the wall beside the cottage window, in a simple oak frame she'd bought at the hardware store in town, hung her father's map. She had touched up the pencil lines where they had faded and left everything else exactly as Harold had drawn it. The small cross in the lower right corner, the coordinates in his handwriting, the note in the margin, grandfather's land, still ours. Don't let it go. She looked at it most mornings with her coffee. Harold had known something Douglas had never understood, and her children were only beginning to learn. That the things worth keeping are rarely the things that look valuable from the outside. A marriage that looked solid, a house that looked like stability, a career, a social position, and name people recognized at dinner parties. Her father had left her a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper that her husband had picked up once, turned over, and set back down. That piece of paper had given her everything. Eleanor Marsh was 67 years old, standing at a cottage window in the early morning light, watching mist come off the river that ran through land her grandfather had worked with his hands. She had lost a house. She had lost the version of her life she'd believed in for nearly 4 decades. She had lost the comfortable certainty that the people who owed her loyalty would pay it when it cost them something. But she had followed the map, and the map had brought her here. If Eleanor's story meant something to you, if you've ever had someone underestimate what you were carrying, leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories about women who find their way back to themselves every single week.